Hi, I'm Eric Lubau, and welcome to Beyond the Belt. This is a conversation with Michael Zolondek, a black belt out of Gainesville, Florida, USA. Michael received his PhD in New Testament language, literature, and theology, with a focus on Jesus as a historical figure. He's also a childhood psychologist focusing on behavior and trauma with his own wellness practice. I hope you enjoy our conversation. Tell me what it was like to get your black belt.
Yeah, so I have a weird circuitous route to the black belt, which was anticlimactic for me a little bit. So I was like, well, first of all, starting with my start in jiu-jitsu, I never really cared for jiu-jitsu much. So my brother kind of got into it. I think he saw some like Eddie Bravo stuff at one point, like years ago in like 2008, 2009. And he was always asking me to do jiu-jitsu with him. And I just was like, okay, like I did fight sports and stuff. So I was like, all right, we'll do a little bit. But I never really cared. You have to drag me into the garage. We had carpet laid out and stuff. So then when I went to Scotland for my PhD, which we'll get into later, he came over there for a visit like the first month and he found a jiu-jitsu school. So we went to that and then I fell in love with jiu-jitsu doing it at that school. It was like a no-gi school and stuff. So that school I stayed at, but it was all no-gi and nobody really cared about belts there. So for probably the first 4 months, maybe longer, I didn't even know belt rankings. People would come in from other schools and train and they'd be like, oh, that guy's a brown belt. I'm like, okay, like what does that mean? Is that good, bad? So like I didn't know anything. So by the time I left, I got a purple belt there, not even from the head instructor. It was basically just like, oh, you're gonna have to be a purple belt. He's the brown belt. He gives you a purple belt. So like, okay, cool. So like that was my like belt ranking. Like got a blue belt from my instructor there, then a purple belt from a brown belt there. And then when I came back here, I didn't really have anything for a while, maybe like a year. And then I connected with a guy named Daniel Valverde in Miami, who's like MMA masters, trained a bunch of people. He's kind of well known in the MMA community a bit. So got our brown belts from him. And then there was another like probably 3 to 4 year period where I never really cared to get a black belt. And I was connected with a guy named Con Ying that I eventually got my black belt from. He was a Marcelo black belt. And he was always like, if you want one, when the time comes, I could give you one. And I'm like, oh, I'll wait. Maybe I'll get one from Marcelo one day. That'll be really cool. So then finally the day came. My mother got sick with cancer and she passed away from it. But I told Con, I'm like, I would love to get it while she's still here and can see it. And I would love to get it my brother David since he started with me. So I was like, at the next promotion, can we do one where you give it to me and David together with my mom kind of seeing it? So he's like, yeah, sure. So that was like, for me, the exciting part wasn't getting a black belt because I never cared about the belts at all. It was more about getting it with my brother and then with my mom seeing it. That was like the big important part for me, kind of that full circle, like end of the story. To reaching that
Did
point.
Did your brother appreciate it? Was he like a little bit angry about how it happened?
No, not at all. He was kind of the same as me. It was just like neither of us really cared much about that ranking system. It was just like it was a cool thing to have one day. We thought like, oh, that'd be a cool like accomplishment just in our own minds. But it was never something like I want this as a status to prove something about my jiu-jitsu or myself to others. So, but I did. I told Khan, I was like, you have to give him his first though. Just he's the older brother and he got me into it. So like I wanted to make sure it was fair. Like he gets his and then I get mine. So he's a black belt technically for like 10 seconds before me. So I like that part of it.
How did your mom feel about all this?
She loved it. She was so excited. And the cool thing was, and this is why I love Khan as just like a person and instructor, he gave my mom an honorary black belt.
Oh my
for
God.
just being, for being such a great mom. So if you go to like the Marcelo Garcia Gainesville website, and you click on the black belts, my mom is listed there as one of the black belts. So I thought that was so cool that like we got 3 black belts together.
That's
as
so
a family
sweet.
there.
Does it
Yeah.
say like honorary next to her name, like in parentheses?
I don't know actually. It might not. It might just say black belt. So I don't know. I have to check again. But yeah. But that was really cool. So she was really excited about that. She was like very thankful to him. My mom loved us so much. So having that done for us by him, she was like very happy and thankful to him for always like being nice to us and taking care of us in that jiu-jitsu side of things.
That's really nice. Are you in any way bummed that it wasn't from Marcelo?
Only, not really bummed, but only like that would have been cool because he was the role model for me for all the jiu-jitsu years. He's awesome. Like the technique is incredible. I kind of copied that game a lot. And then just as a person, he's just seems like a really genuine, nice person. I got to meet him on a trip one time with Khan because Khan's a friend of his. And he was just the nicest person ever.
He absolutely is one of the nicest people. I trained at
Yeah.
his gym. I got my blue belt from Marcelo and Bernardo and
Nice.
Paul, and
Yeah.
I do nothing, absolutely nothing negative to say about Marcelo.
Exactly. Yeah, no, just the most welcoming, nice person. So I think that's the only part that would have been like, oh, that would be cool to, that's like more the status thing in my mind of like, oh, that would have been cool to get it from Marcelo because he was such a big name and like such an influence on the jiu-jitsu thing. But honestly, I'm like, I kind of like that I got it with my brother. I would rather have gotten one with my brother together than gotten one from Marcelo separately. So like that's the only like mix there is would have been cool
Yeah.
as like that high name kind of thing, but this was so much more meaningful that there's no regrets at all on that end.
At the end of the day, it's like the emotion of the situation and the memory more
Exactly.
than the 2 inches around your waist, so to speak.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yep.
Did anything change for you? Like when you hit that mat the first time afterwards, did it feel different for you? Was it a target on your back?
That, I was gonna say that's the only thing I think is that like from other people it was funny, just because like oh he's a black belt now, but like it was almost like sarcastic because everybody recognized like okay nothing changes, you're just now a black belt, and I think because it was so long, so my like white belt to brown belt was like 3 years only, like 3.5 years, something like that, and then from brown belt to black because I never trained under another gym at that point except for cons, it was like another 8 years. So I was just at a high level for so long and like training with a bunch of people and I would train with black belts and have like fun rounds and stuff. So like nothing really changed in my mind at that point because it felt like a thing for so long that I was okay, I'm at this level. I just feel good here. So getting it was more again, like you said, the emotional side of it, like this accomplishment with my brother, my mom seeing it in this nice gym with like friends around. And then yeah, the change was just like people like laughing about it. And then newer people, if they came in, it's like, okay, black belt. But in my mind, it's like, okay, yeah, that's
Does
like
does your brother ever be like, hey, I'm the elder black belt here, like like this is how you do the move?
No, not really. We'll tease that a little bit, but we're very like encouraging of each other. We always have been. So if you ask him, he'll tell you that I'm the better one, and I always like destroy him, and I know stuff so much better. And if you ask me, I'll tell you like he probably gets 70, 80 to 20% the better of me, right? So just depends who you ask, but we typically are like way more encouraging to the other one than like teasing each other about who's higher. But he does always get to say he was a black belt first, so that's just the funny side of it, which I think is cool.
I mean, that kind of works out for him, I think, pretty well,
Yeah,
especially since you set it up and you can always be like, well, I set this one up.
yeah, and like I said, I felt in my mind like that's fair, like a good full circle. He got me into it. I never cared. He found the gym in Scotland that got me going with it. He found Con here in Gainesville and the Marcelo School, so I was like, okay, that's like a cool symbolic recognition of like, yeah, this was your kind of you started this journey, so you get to like finish it first.
Is there anything that was sort of surprising to you about getting into BJJ, like a completely separate second time?
Yeah. What do you mean like second time? Like
Well, you
from
said
getting
you
the black belt
started it
on?
and you were kind of working out in the gym, in the garage rather, and then you get
Yeah.
into Scotland and you're like, actually, this is different. Like, what surprised you about that, or what was different for you about that?
Well, so that was kind of the thing. Like, I never really started here. So when my brother got into it, it was just us doing it in the garage. Like, we never trained anywhere. When I went away to, I think it was like a year maybe or 6 months, I had gone back to school in Miami for a bit. That he went to a few gyms to train here, but I never went anywhere. So there's probably like a 6 month gap. I would come home and visit all the time, but I never like trained regularly in any jiu-jitsu gym. So I never really knew jiu-jitsu really outside of like some YouTube videos and what my brother told me. My brother's name's David, by the way. So David told me this stuff about it. I'm like, okay, cool. I'll try this out or try that out. And then when we went to the gym there, it was such a cool experience. And I was a spazzy, like going crazy the whole time in the class, like not knowing anything, but just putting my full like effort into everything I did. But it was just so cool to see the techniques we did back. I remember even the technique that we did. We were doing just positional sparring from back and just the struggle to try to get out of it and not knowing what the hell is going on and why I can't do like get out of this stuff. Because I had done boxing my whole life. I had done like traditional kung fu. I had done Muay Thai, excelled at all of them, and then excelled at other sports. And I'm in there, I'm like, I cannot do anything here. Like, what is happening? That was so much fun. So I think seeing that part of it, where it wasn't just two beginners kind of going at it and trying to figure out stuff, but you had people there, and I saw like real jiu-jitsu in action. That made it so fun. Like
Do you
wow, this
think
is a different
it was
experience.
anything to do with like the teaching or the school, or you think it was just the technique level that was the separator, the differentiator for you?
Yeah, probably combination. Because I think if I went to a school with like a mean instructor or something, or a school that was like very heavy on drilling, I probably maybe wouldn't have stuck with it. But this school, the instructor is kind of like a complex personality. To some people, he was a real like jerk. Like people would not like him. It was just like an attitude thing. But everybody loved his jujitsu teaching. Like got people good incredibly fast because it was all basically positional sparring type training. We would do like a bit of a technique, maybe drill a little bit to warm up, and then just fight it out in the position. And like micro fighting, so like back controls, like just break the hands, right, or escape your hips or something. So I think that was the fun of it. It was just all fight, like you fought the whole time. You did jujitsu the whole time. It wasn't sitting around for 10 minutes looking at a technique demo and then drilling for 10 minutes slowly and not really doing anything, and then a little bit of open mat or something. It was like you fought the whole time. And I feel like that was the really fun part of it. And it was such like micro doses of learning that it made it really easy. So you saw progress every single time. It wasn't a 4-step move that you would struggle with for 2 months. It was like frame. So we fought a whole class getting frames into side control. And you go and fight somebody in the open mat and you got a frame and you're like, oh, I did it. Like I did the thing. So it was like,
I love classes on frames. My
yeah,
jujitsu teaching is like super, super basic. I always focus on
right.
very basic concepts. Frames is one of my favorite things to teach.
Yeah. And it's great on the student end because, like I said, you feel accomplished at the end of the class. You don't feel confused. You're not lacking the move. You don't forget the move later. It's like, I did something really cool. I did the move and it worked. So I think that was kind of the mix of it, the teaching style and just fighting out fully in it and being able to like implement stuff right away in a full jiu-jitsu match was
Do you
really
feel like there was
exciting.
anything that was better for your learning around that versus the sort of three techniques, positional sparring, full sparring?
Yeah, for me, I always feel like, because I come from a teaching background myself, so I feel like for me that's a better learning process. Like I feel like it fits with like teaching pedagogy better a little bit. I kind of always liken it to language learning, and I don't know if that is the best analogy, but I felt like in that gym we were like doing immersive conversational learning versus like learn 10 vocabulary words, learn a little bit of verbal conjugation, noun declension, right? And then like you get in a conversation, it's like crap. It was okay. This is okay. Then you got to put this here. It's like confusing in that way for me. So to this day, I'm not good at drilling. If you ask me to drill an armbar, like I would probably look like an idiot. But in a full sparring match, I would do it really well because it's just different movement. The person reacts differently. So for me, it was like we were doing like immersive language learning, which is always, I feel, the best versus like piecemeal language learning.
That's so fascinating. That's not how I would think about this at all. Like I
Yeah.
think about learning jujitsu in a language learning concept, but I do it differently. Like to me, the
Yeah.
moves themselves are vocabulary words. And so
Right.
you need some vocabulary, but ultimately the
Yeah.
grammar is what stitches it together. And the grammar is like frames, posts, like
Yeah.
direction of energy, intensity, regulated
Yeah.
tension, and all of those things working back and forth through them give you the ability to structure your vocabulary
Right.
in
Yeah.
specific ways.
Yeah, I really like that. The thing that I would add on to that, right, is how you're learning the vocabulary and grammar. Is it through the live mini positional sparring, or is it through the slower, like bit by bit, where you drill and then do a little bit and then do the full sparring, right? So for me, that immersion is the like live sparring round, not a full sparring round, but like we would start out inside with the person in the underhook and the elbow out in the hip, and it's like your job is to get the frame in. 3 minute round. We used to do 6 minute rounds. So 6 minutes, and all the top person would do was try to keep the frames out, and all you would do on the bottom person is try to get a frame in. And that was, we learned like a few moves of how to do it, and then you just did that for 6 minutes. And it's an incredible learning experience because you're not just drilling at a low pace, and then the person actually pins you down, and now you're struggling how to get it in there. It's like, no, you fought it out, but it was such a small move, and there were no other transitions, so you didn't have to worry about the person going to mount or taking your back or doing a submission, something like that. It was just like a full-on fight to get your frames in. Then again, when you got into the full sparring match, it's like, oh, I can do that. Now I get submitted afterward, but I got the frames in at least, right? So that's the only other bit that like I add on to the language learning models, like immersion versus non-immersion learning is like how I see that.
Do
That
you take that
distinction
into
in
your
it.
teaching? Like, is that the style when you teach that you just do that exact same conceptual model for people?
Pretty much. Like, it has to be a little bit different because it's not my gym, right? I just teach one class a week for con. So I try to keep it basic to everybody. And the model that we had in Scotland as well, we would do like 3 weeks on a position. So if it was side control, it'd be like 1 week focus on the bottom person, 1 week focus on the top person, and then 1 week equivalent, like just give feedback on both. But it was like we had a rule for we called it like black belt club to get like to the black belt level as fast as can. It was like you had to come to at least 2 classes a week and an open mat outside of that. So only teaching one class a week is harder because I can't like repeat the same position or build on the teaching as much. So I can't go like one day frames, the next day hip outs, the third day the escape, right? So for me, I kind of like, I do one full technique, an armbar, let's say, and then we'll drill that for a warm up, the technique of it to get used to it. And then we'll fight it out from a position 4 through 6 rounds. 3 rounds bottom, 3 rounds top, and then we do open mat. So I kind of bring in as much as I can, but with the knowledge that like not everybody's learning that way, and I don't really have the class structure to kind of make it work out the same way that we had it over in Scotland.
Yeah, that's interesting. I think that when I think about how information gets conveyed, I usually end up back at there's so many people who learn in so many different ways that if you vary the classes and the class style and the information delivery style, some people are going to get annoyed one day and then the next day they might have a way better information retention or ingestion capability. So
yeah, 100%. And that again goes back to just basic teaching knowledge. Yeah, visual learners, there could be like auditory learners, right? Tactile learners. So I'm very visual. If you make me do something, I'm going to struggle with it. If I watch you do it, I'll get it in like 10 seconds because I'm just very good at like translating what I see to doing it with my body. My brother, I think, is more like he has to do it. I think if he watches it, he struggles a bit. But if he does it, like right away, he'll get it easily. So yeah, different learning styles can go well with different people. You just have to like understand that you have to like give variety in how you're offering it to people.
Have you pulled any of those teaching lessons from jiu-jitsu into teaching professionally? Because I know you're a professor as well. Or did they just go the other way?
I was going to say, I think it probably went more the other way, but I think it helps in jiu-jitsu because there's way more variety, I think. So I teach like religious studies and like I said, I do therapy with a pretty standard, like one population. So there's less variety in like the people that you're dealing with, but jiu-jitsu is helpful because it opens you up to, like you said, different learning styles, but also different reasons for people doing stuff. So there's people there who maybe don't even care about learning that much. They're just there for a lot of fun. So they might not care to have a very detailed lesson on something. They just want to like go and do some rolls and have fun like that. Other people are like competition level. I want to learn every single detail and minutia of a move. So that's kind of helpful to take over if I'm teaching somebody in religion or doing therapy. It's like, okay, not everybody is learning religion for religion. They might just be doing it as an elective or for family reasons or something. So that I think helped from jiu-jitsu, just a variety of people, different reasons for doing stuff. That's helpful to not see your clients and students in like a monolithic way.
I want to talk about the religion thing, but before we shift over to that, because you do therapy and because you're kind of in this religion mindset, which they tend to be like a little bit softer, what kind of community does that create, or what kind of teaching environment do you end up creating on the mat with that kind of background, as opposed to maybe just like a little bit more pure jiu-jitsu martial arts kind of mentality?
I would say way more like validating and loose in terms of like what people are doing. When they come in, people come in late and be like, oh, I'm so sorry I'm late. I'm like, dude, you're an adult. Like, you have a life. The ones who have kids, like, I don't come whenever you want. Skip the warm-up. Don't skip the warm-up. Like, I'll tell you, it's probably better to warm up so you don't get hurt, but your call. I don't care what you do. If you need to talk or take a call, go ahead. Just whisper so that you're not distracting me. I always tell them, like, I get distracted, so if I hear you talking, I'm going to be thinking about that. So just as long as you're polite, I don't care. I'm not going to be like a drill instructor. If you want to do this technique and then drill something else once you feel like you have that technique, cool. Like, I'm not going to tell you and yell at you to do an armbar the whole time if you feel like you want to try something else. This is like your time, you're paying. So yeah, it's like a very validating, this is your time. I want you to get what you want out of the experience as long as you're not taking away from other people. Cool. Like, I'm happy with what you're doing. Have fun. Yeah, and it's always a very like, encouraging mindset, not like, all right, doing it wrong.
Yeah, I try to be the same. And also, I very much understand that people are like, this is not my main thing. This is often my
Right.
escape.
Exactly. Yeah. That's the biggest thing. It's like, I know you're coming here to get out of like stress of daily life or get away from certain people or whatever you want. But I don't want to add on to like some stress that you have when you're trying to enjoy life here.
Yeah. Yeah, same. So I want to get into the religion thing. Can you tell
Yeah.
me a little bit about what your PhD is about?
Yeah. So my PhD, the whole PhD is technically New Testament language, literature, and theology. Mine is kind of like a very niche specific study. It's a study of the historical Jesus. So it's Jesus as the historical figure, just like you would study Caesar or Alexander the Great or something like that. There's the legends that kind of develop about the person, extra community stories, stuff like this. And we want to kind of see what's most likely that the person who existed in that time did or said and what they were thinking and trying to do, right? Their intentions, stuff like that. So that's historical Jesus studies. And then a little bit tangential to that is kind of like the theology aspect, because you have to know that. You have to know what the Jewish theology was at the time, what the Christian theologies were after Jesus, what the Roman kind of culture was at the time. So yeah, it's less of like the theology part of it, of like thinking about what that means for people today, and more of like the historical side of it.
How did you
And
get
obviously
into
they
that?
crisscross. Yeah, so again, a long route. So I'm from a mixed religion home. So my mom was Catholic, my dad's Jewish. I was raised more in the Catholic line of stuff. So my mom would like take me to church and like instill those types of values in the home. It wasn't like very strict, but it was just like an informed life, your decisions, how you treat people, stuff like that. And the Jewish side would come in with the same thing. It was more of like that social justice side of things on both the Catholic and Jewish side. So that like informed how we lived, how we treated people. So I was like hating school. Like I hated school. I was saying I'm going to go be like a laborer. I'd rather just have something where I work with my hands and not have to study or deal with that nonsense. But then I got really into religion. I was asking my mom, why don't Christians celebrate Jewish holidays if Jesus was Jewish and the followers were Jewish? And she was like, I don't know. My dad didn't know. So like, read about it, like look it up maybe. So I started doing that. And then I read like all these sorts of different things about Christianity, about how it was wrong, how it was right, how Judaism was wrong or right. And I was like, this is like fascinating. So I was just spending I was homeschooled, but I was spending all my time just looking up the religion stuff and not doing any of the work. So my dad and my mom to some extent as well was like, why don't you just try that in school? There's like religion programs. So I went around looking for different religion programs, and one of the best ones was in FIU in Miami. So I chose that one, and then went all the way to a PhD with it. Still hated school, hated like every other subject. I was just like getting through every other subject to study the thing that I liked. But yeah, so it kind of started just from a personal place of not knowing like certain answers to questions, and then just took off from there, never really stopped.
So it sounds like you didn't bother going like the clergy seminary kind of route. Like,
No.
why did you make that distinction? Was it just like the academic information that you liked, or was there something about the religion itself that spoke to you?
It was both. So it was both personal learning about it, but also I just liked the academic, like detective learning side of it. The seminary side is more, you still do, it depends on the seminary, you still do a lot of like historical work and study, but it's for the purpose of like preaching and doing pastoral work. If you're a priest, that's getting to the priesthood. That interested me less than like the academic side of it. But it was still very personally like important and fulfilling to understand this stuff and to like live life. I wanted to know in my own mind, like, do I believe in a God? Do I believe that Jesus was this, or that? Or do I believe that he was not these things and he didn't really say any of this stuff? I was like, okay, I want to know, like, formulate an informed opinion here if it's going to kind of give my life direction. So that was kind of the big driver, just a personal fascination. And then the academic side took hold because I just enjoyed the learning detective side of it, like figuring out history and stuff.
So are you religious at all?
Yeah, so that's the thing. It's hard for me to describe it because I consider myself like deeply religious and like a mix of Christian and Jewish like traditions and faith values. But I don't like saying that because in the US especially, if you say you're very religious, you're automatically thought of as like conservative, Republican, evangelical type of religious. And I'm very, very far from that. So like I'll pray daily. I believe in God. I believe in a certain way of Jesus, right? Like there's these things I believe. I try to follow the obligations that I see in biblical text, but I'm not like forcing that upon other people. I don't have like 3 moral issues in my life that I center my whole life around and like politics around and stuff.
Yeah.
So it's a much different, like, kind of, I think, religion than many people in the US like automatically would pigeonhole people into. So it's a hard thing. But yeah, for me, I consider myself very religious.
So did the fact that you were religious, actually, let me change that a little bit. Did the fact that you were studying religion change your view on the religion itself, or studying Jesus change your view on the religion itself?
Yeah, in some ways, yes, in some ways, no. So yeah, the first things I read were very like anti-religious because that's typically what would come up first. So I would read all these things about how Jesus like never really existed, or he didn't say or do this thing, or like this was made up, and I'm like, crap, like really? Well, that's crazy. Like how am I believing this stuff then? But then my mind started going. I'm like, wait, but like there's so many people that believe it. There's like philosophers that believe it. There's scientists that believe it. There's just really well studied. I'm like, so why is this not more of just like a standard thing across academia and stuff? So I'm like, okay, let me look up like counter arguments to this. And so I would see opposite arguments. So like, okay, that kind of makes sense there. And then so I would just kind of like do that all the time. I would read just anything I got my hands on, and the thing that made most sense to me, I kind of went with that thing. And if it felt like it was accurate, that like informed the way I believed. So in some ways, the things that I learned kind of validate and affirm things I already believed. In other ways, it was the opposite. So I might have started out with thinking that the Bible has to be interpreted literally to start with, maybe. So you would think like, okay, the earth has to be this many years old, or there's actually this many days of creation, or, you know, was Jesus literally born of a virgin? I don't know the answer to that question. I could give you like my ideas of like what the meaning of the Bible was and what they intended to say, but it's like that stuff I was able to let go of more because I learned that the authors often didn't intend it to be literal. So why would I take it literal now if the authors didn't intend it that way in their time? So stuff like that would change. And then other ones would be more affirming, like the fact that Jesus existed. That's a pretty standard scholarly opinion. So I'm like, okay, that's affirmed, right? Like, so that's kind of like sometimes it would affirm, sometimes it would challenge.
That's so interesting. I wonder how often, like, I try to be a little bit, I think you do as well. As an academic, you try to be like a little bit, oh, if I read something, let me make sure that I can validate it in some way.
Yeah.
But I imagine that as somebody who is researching the real life historical Jesus, there's probably a lot of counter or like just counterfactual, non-factual, and also factual stuff. Like,
Yeah.
how do you even figure out what's factual versus non-factual?
Yeah. Well, that's where like a lot of the methodological issues come up, right? Where it's like there's a historical methodology, and my gripe with historical Jesus studies that we haven't really done it the same as other scholars sometimes in a more critical way, actually, right? So I feel like more of of the Gospels would be accepted if we were more aligned with how actual like other ancient historians do it. I feel like we're overly critical for obvious reasons. Christianity is like living religion. It's informing politics throughout history, right? But yeah, pretty much it's like you're looking at text, you're looking for basic things like independent verification of stuff, right? So if you have two sources that you're pretty sure weren't borrowing from each other or a similar stream of tradition, okay, this is likely something to have happened, right? It's kind of like independent newspapers reporting things today. You're more likely to accept something from independent sources than just one source. There's stuff like contradicting sort of what somebody would say of that person. So if you heard somebody say, oh, Obama was for like giving tax breaks to the rich, you would be like, well, that doesn't make sense politically. Like he wouldn't really do that. But if you heard somebody from their following, like a Democratic source saying, oh, well, actually he said, you know, one moment he praised Bush at a time, it's like, ooh, okay, that goes against that like person's biases. So maybe that's true if that's one of Obama's trusted advisors and he's saying something against, like contradictory to what Obama would normally say. It's like, oh, that's probably an interesting thing that actually went back to that. So the common famous one in historical Jesus studies is the crucifixion. It's likely that he was crucified, and likely that he was crucified with a tab, I forgot the name for now, the inscription King of the Jews, because that was actually like more derogatory. And it wasn't usually Christian language. Christians didn't typically call him King of the Jews. They called him other like higher titles. And crucifixion was such a demeaning way to die, and they were trying to like justify it in the text why he died that way. So it's kind of like, okay, that goes against what a Christian would have maybe made up if they were trying to show this divine like hero type of thing. So that's kind of one of the reasons why many scholars say, yeah, likely he was crucified, because it goes against the tendencies of the early church and stuff like that. And there's little debates, mini debates within all that. But yeah, there's historical methodologies that are very like tedious that you go through to try to figure those things
is that
out.
what the criteria of authenticity work kind of does? Kind of gets into?
Yeah, which is where a lot of the debate is in historical Jesus studies, right? So I used them before because if you go into historical Jesus studies, that's like your base. You learn, at least you did like 10, 15 years ago, you learned the criteria of authenticity, you applied different sayings to it, and then you tested them to see if they fit it or not. There's so much debate around it now, though, that people don't really like it so much because, for instance, the one I was just talking about, like going against the author's bias, or if something's going with it, you would dismiss it, right? So it doesn't fit that criteria, so it's not likely to be historical. But there's lots of good things that happen that Jesus said that fit with Christianity that he probably likely said. So you can't just throw those out, right? And there's a lot of stuff probably that like fits with these criteria that maybe weren't accurate or weren't actually historical, even if it goes against the tendency, because maybe at the time in a certain community, it had no problem. There was no contradiction with their beliefs or their tendencies, so they kept it there. Whereas another community might have then found it objectionable and then dismissed it, right? So it's like there's all these mini debates within the criteria that people are usually like, we got to be really careful with how you apply these and make sure they're very like cautiously applied and not just seen as like, okay, A, B, C, authentic, historical, goes back to Jesus, versus, doesn't hit those, dismiss them. So yeah, that's where you start this criteria, but it's like very tricky with the criteria these days.
Is there any particular thing that you focused on when it came to this criteria? And for like context, I think some of the criteria that you were focused on was like, or the example was like multiple attestation or something like that. And then the example you gave of Obama and Bush would be like embarrassment.
Yeah, exactly.
Something like that. Like, what are some of the other ones that are relevant?
So there's several. Those I like those a little bit more, but again, I try not to use them as criteria, right? So it's the application as much as the like reasoning behind using them. So almost every ancient historian will use multiple attestation, but what they use really is more broad. So it's like we have multiply attested sources that talk about this king doing these things. They don't really just pick piecemeal a tradition, right? Or a one story in the source and be like, okay, let's see if it's multiply attested everywhere. It's more like, okay, we have numerous sources writing about Alexander or Caesar or Cato, right? The elder that we can accept that they're a person. They said these things, they were involved in politics. That's more of like a common thing. Some of the lesser ones that I find a little bit troublesome are like embarrassment, for example, might be one that's difficult to figure out all the time. You can't just use it as like, this makes sense, because again, it depends when that story was written and by whom. There are some theories about like there are early baptism communities in the Christian communities that existed that like John the Baptist and were maybe followers of his that then followed Jesus. So maybe they liked the story about Jesus being baptized and it showed authority there for him. And it was a good, meaningful connection between their former teacher and their current Messiah, right, Savior. Other people who didn't really have a connection to John the Baptist might have wanted to take that out, right? So later on, you see in the Gospel of John, there's really no baptism mentioned. In others, it's like there's no mention of John necessarily baptizing Jesus. It's just like he was baptized, right? And the Holy Spirit came down on him, but it's not really, there's no explanation like really who did it, or there's not much harping on who did it. So that one you can't really use necessarily, right? Because this community might have invented it because it fit their needs. And then the later communities found it embarrassing and took it out. So the criterion of embarrassment might not fit there because it might not have been embarrassing for that early community. So that's where like those become troublesome to use. And that goes for all the criteria. But there's other ones like coherence. So anything that comes through the New Testament or the Gospels, at least in Aramaic, if there's some Greek transliteration of Aramaic words, or if there's actual Aramaic words, or if there's Greek that doesn't make sense in the Greek, but makes sense in the Aramaic, it's like, okay, this might go back to an early tradition, so more likely to be historical, something Jesus said. Could be stuff that only makes sense for their time. So if I were to tell you, like, my dad was using an 8-track, that makes sense, right? Because my dad was likely alive during that time. If I told you, oh, my student in class today in 2024 brought an 8-track in, then you're like, oh, that probably doesn't make sense. So the criterion of like coherence or incoherence is another one that's helpful, but you can't just rely on that, right? Because I could know his history as well and just make up that story to fit that. So that's why they're so tricky to go through.
Is there any like cattiness to researching Jesus? Like I was thinking about this as you were talking about people having like very counter viewpoints based on what they
Yeah.
want or want to. But I mean, was there people who were like, Jesus is a figure, stop trying to be specific about his history? Or was that not how you were treated?
There's so much cattiness. It's so funny. Like there's so much weird stuff that goes on, which is why I kind of like veered away from it as a professional fully side. So there's this scholar from like, he wrote a book in like 1906. His name is Albert Schweitzer, one of the best known like scholars in Jesus religion, later become well known as a doctor. So people in the medical field know him as like a medical missionary. He went to Africa, opened up hospitals everywhere. But his famous kind of quote that's sort of attributed to him is the historical Jesus scholars of his time looked down the deep dark well of history and saw only their own reflection. And that's like, I think very much the case for so many scholars these days. It's like everybody gets catty because they're doing historical research, and especially with the criteria, you could come up with any Jesus you want. Like you can make stuff fit any criteria. You could choose two of them. So if I choose dissimilarity, right, and multiple attestation, my Jesus is dissimilar from Judaism and Christianity. So now I could like say Jesus wasn't like Christianity or Judaism and make up anything I want that kind of fits with him. But your problem is like, okay, but then how does a Jesus that's not like Judaism or Christianity exist in that time and draw the following? So it's like, that doesn't make sense, but people do that sometimes. So they made dissimilar Jesuses, but there's so much of that of like, you're doing this and that's not right. You got to change it this way. And like, there's no point in doing this. And you have the more conservative scholars who are like, the Jesus of history and the Jesus and the Christ of faith are different. They don't matter to each other. So what's the point of doing the historical side of it? And our historical interests are like, it's still good. Like we still want to know about it.
Is the technology of today helpful in any way? Like I'm constantly seeing we've used AI to figure out what was written on this scroll, and that's opened up new things, or we're using LiDAR to like find new caves that have scrolls. Like, is any of that stuff more recently helpful, or does it end up causing more, I don't know, confusion?
I would say it's really helpful in the text criticism side of things. So an archaeological side of stuff. So text criticism would be like seeing what texts are written when, how they've changed, the transmission of the text through different communities. That can be really helpful because AI will I saw it, I think on the Dead Sea Scrolls recently, that AI was able to like reconstruct parts of a Dead Sea Scrolls that we couldn't see or construct with our human eyes, right? So that's fascinating because then you get more information out of this stuff. So it's really helpful in that part of it. The historical side is more difficult because you still have to then interpret that, right? So everything is just artifacts that are passed down to us through history. Historians just interpret them and give an argument behind how they should be understood. So very helpful in terms of like finding more artifacts and learning more out of text. Creates more debates because the more information you have, the more you can debate this stuff. So that's like the good and not necessarily bad of it, but the helpful and then the really like complicated, complex side of it that comes through.
There was something you said earlier that I wanted to ask more about, which was about the cultural context, about how Jews of the time would have viewed Jesus versus his disciples.
Yeah.
What kind of cultural context was that different? Like, I don't know how that would seem different.
Right. So very complicated one. So we don't even talk about Judaism at that time. We talk about Judaisms, right, of the time. Because there were at least 4 sects that we know about at the time that were really different from each other in many ways. And then within those sects, there was probably many minor differences within communities, right? So you have lots of different Jewish beliefs. So there's some Jews at that time that believed in a resurrection. Some didn't. Some believed in a Messiah. Some didn't. Some believed in divine intervention in overthrowing Romans. Some didn't. Some believed that the Romans were there and they're going to take it. We should like appease them and like just get along as much as we can. So there was many different Judaisms in the day. The Judaism that we have today grew out of like one typical stream of them, which was what they called the Pharisees, which I don't like the way Christians often use it as like an evil or bad foil to Christians, because Jesus was more likely aligned out of that Pharisaical school than any others. So Pharisees aren't bad in any way. They're like a really good sect of Judaism. That's the sect that kind of continued, from which we have Judaism today mostly. That sort of school of thought. So
Can you
we
just
only
define,
have,
like, I grew up Jewish, so I
yeah,
grew up mostly Reform, which is kind of
yeah,
like
okay, yeah,
like decaf Judaism, I guess.
yeah, yeah,
But what
the
is
more
I've
liberal
never
side
heard
of it,
that
yeah.
term before. What's the
Yeah. So
Pharisee?
yeah, so Pharisees were one sect that focused heavily. So they had a certain proportion of the Bible. So there was like these other groups like Samaritans only kind of really thought the Torah was good. Sadducean groups were like a priestly group, so they focused heavily on the Torah and didn't really like some of the prophets and writings, Nevi'im and Ketuvim they're called in like Hebrew. So different like philosophical views of stuff. Pharisees were very much more kind of like a communal people oriented group, right? You were heavily focused on the laws in the Torah, a group that kind of like appreciated prophecy. They were a group that did believe in messianic figures, more along the lines of like a Davidic Messiah, so a kingly royal Messiah versus like a priestly Messiah that came through other schools of thought in the Judaisms at that time. And they were the ones that focused heavily on like minutia of the law. So when you're hearing things in the Gospels about Jesus arguing about laws with the Pharisees and the Pharisees being too caught up in law versus like just appreciation of God, that's the side of like Judaism that you would see continue today, where it's like very Torah centered. Judaism is a very academic religion. A lot of times it's thought of very lot of minutia on the laws, right?
Is
A
that
lot of
why
what
the
they call
Haftorah and the Gemara are sort of like, hey, like as long as you follow everything within this circle, you're okay, and then this circle, you're okay.
right. Yep. You're making the hard.
Very cute.
That's awesome. Yeah. No, but exactly. So, the Pharisaical school, right, would come up with the guardrails on stuff. So let's say you can't make fire, right, on Sabbath, or you can't do labor. They would add on different layers or fences to that. So you can't use electricity because there's a spark, right, that turns on the electricity. You can't carry change in your pocket because that might be carrying a load, like labor load, right? So there's all these like really famous sort of fences around the law, which aren't really what the laws say, but they're trying to build guardrails so that if you accidentally violate one of those, it's at least you're away from like the ultimate violation of one of those laws. And that's what Jesus in the New Testament is often arguing about, right? Like, what's the intention of these laws? What's like the purpose behind them on God's end, right? And then you're like building up these extra fences. That's like you're putting unnecessary burdens on people that are already struggling to live. So that's not what you need to do. So that's what Rabbinic Judaism today and like the very like Chabad, Lubavitch type Judaism, right? Super strict, insular community. They're really heavy on following these laws extremely strictly. Whereas like a Reform Judaism would be like, no, we see them more as they can be developed, right? And they change. There's evolutionary view of the laws and stuff and how they're applied. So it's much less strict on how you're applying those laws and seeing them. So yeah, that's kind of like
because Jesus was so focused, or some of the discussions that were written about Jesus being focused on the laws were so pervasive. Does that
yeah.
mean that he thought himself to be the Messiah because he could like have such a strong opinion, or was he just sort of having like an argument over dinner about the laws and then everyone kind of wrote that down?
Again, it depends on how you saw the Messiah, right? And what you thought about, and the question of like what Jesus was enacting, what role he was enacting in his life, intentionally or just because that's the role he thought he was supposed to fit, right? Whether he wanted to or not. So there are some traditions about there being like a new Moses, and that Messiah would kind of like live up to this new Moses and be like not a rebirth, but like a reinstating of Mosaic stuff, right? There would be a new Torah, a new law. This new Moses now will restore kind of Israel to former glory and former observation of law in front of God, right? And loyalty. So that's where like the Sermon on the Mount and stuff is really important. And especially in the book of Matthew is known as a very Jewish author. So for him, showing Jesus as this new Moses or as like living in this Moses mold was very important, because it shows as him being in this Messianic mold, because the Messiah is going to bring back observance to the law and like have the authoritative statements on the law and stuff like that. So that's why it's very important in Matthew to show that he's having these arguments about the law and like getting the best of the Pharisees who are like experts in the law and showing where they're going wrong and showing where they're right. So that's kind of like a very Matthean Jewish, like kind of Pharisaical Jewish viewpoint of stuff going on there. So
not to spoil like spoil your second book, but like, is this saying that he thinks he's the Messiah, or he's just saying like, hey, I'm just a guy who's talking about stuff and it seems right?
So I have to premise that, right, with when this is what I do in my first book is I kind of go through great lengths to show that in that time and place, that culture, there wasn't really the individualistic personality like we see today, where I live in a community and I make my own choices of who I am and what I believe and what I do in my life, right? My dad wants me to be a lawyer, parents want me to be a lawyer. I'm going to say, nah, I'm my own person. I'm going to go be an artist, right? That's not how it existed in that time. In that time, we had what's called like dyadic or polyadic personalities, where you would essentially live in the mold that you believed other people or God, your calling was, you would enact that role, whether you thought yourself that way or not. So the question isn't so much what Jesus thought he was or whether he thought he was the Messiah. It's was he doing and saying things that show that he was trying to intentionally enact that role? For me in that book, I say yes, because what I do is I show a lot of the things that he said and did, they could be interpreted in different ways, right? So preaching about the coming kingdom of God, anybody can do that essentially, right? Like a prophet could do that, a rabbi can do that, even though rabbis didn't really exist in that time, that term, right? It's meant a different thing. But like teachers can do that, right? And messiahs can do that. They can preach the coming kingdom of God. And there were other messianic figures at the time who did just that. That alone doesn't make him the Messiah. But when you add on a bunch of the other stuff that he did, right? So gathering 12 disciples is a really specific thing. It's like the regathering of Israel, right? 12 tribes.
Yeah.
That's on there. Yeah. So talking about the law and being authoritative with the law, going to the temple and doing some sort of demonstrative action in the temple like he did, that's very important, like because the Messiah was supposed to rebuild the temple and restore it to its glory in a lot of these visions. So all this stuff that he was doing, all these different points are fitting the messianic role, and the people around him, both enemies and followers, are seeing him as a messianic person. So his followers saw him as living up to that role. Other people saw him as, you're a false Messiah, either bringing up hopes of people and you're going to get us killed, the Jews were saying, right? Like, you're going to cause like the Romans to react to us. You can't do this. You're violating our own beliefs that we don't think you're the Messiah. And then Romans are like, hey, what are you doing here, you pretend king? Like, you're not going to cause an uprising here. We have enough of those. So like everybody's seeing him in this kind of messianic royal role, and he's doing things that match it. So for me, again, as a historian looking at just probabilities, it's like, to me, it makes the most sense that he was living in that royal messianic role. Just like all the evidence like points to that and comes together for me in that way.
Is that
so? Yeah, for me, I say yes.
Naysayers of your work would sort of lean on, like, hey, this is just his view because not everybody thought that he was taking on that role, or maybe he didn't think he was taking on.
Yeah, that's exactly what they do. The big question in historical Jesus studies was, what did Jesus think of himself? And that was like a challenge, because you can't get, and people would say like, we can't get into psychology of him, so you don't really know. But they would still try to figure out based on what he was saying and doing. So that's where I tried to take like a little bit of a different tact. It's like, I don't care what he thought about himself. Like, if he actually thought about this, what did he do, right? So like, again, Martin Luther King, I think, is a good example of that, because there are some parts of it where people say like, he never really wanted to be like this leader that a lot of other people put him into. But he kind of like took on that role and went that way because he saw the need for this to happen. But he wasn't always thrilled to be in that position of that leadership role. He was like, I don't want to be this big like civil rights voice, and like it's putting too much on me. I'm not like that big of a person to be doing this. So I think that's a very good example. And you can find many examples of that today, of people doing stuff that they don't personally see themselves as or like worthy of being in there, but they take on the role because other people are seeing them, or they see the good in it, or like the purpose behind it. So I think that's like the best analogy of that, really. It's like, I don't care what he thought about himself. I just care about what it looks like he did and what other people thought he did. And the reason why the other people are so important, like the disciples seeing him in that role, is because, again, as a dyadic personality, if they're seeing him in that role and he's starting to see that as like his divine, like mandated role, he's going to take that on whether he thinks it or not. At least the typical personality of that time would do that. So for those reasons, I'm like, I don't care, but it does leave the entryway to other people. Again, the big thing is that everything that he says and does doesn't necessarily point to royal Davidic messianic roles, right? You could interpret them differently. So again, if I use certain criteria to eliminate certain things he said or did, then I'm left with only the exorcism part. So then Jesus is only an exorcist for me, and he never really entered the temple or did any of that stuff. He wasn't really crucified as king of the Jews. So like that's historically made up, and we're only left with the exorcism or exorcist Jesus at that point, right? Or the healer Jesus. Yeah, so you can, like, you can see yourself at the bottom of the well, right? You could like pick and choose in this state. But that's not isolated to Jesus. People do that with other figures, whether they want to emphasize the figure's political like ambitions, or they say like, no, they're more military personality. So it happens elsewhere. It's just Jesus is the most
polarizing of all
exactly.
figures possible.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah, this was fascinating, but I want to make sure we also talk about some of the other stuff you do.
Yeah.
Which, this is like a fascinating contrast to me. You're also a children's trauma therapist.
Yeah.
Which, like, so Jiu-Jitsu black belt, Messianic Jesus, Davidic Messiah scholar, and children's trauma therapist. How did you shift over to children's trauma therapy from all that other schooling?
Yeah, another really circuitous route, right? So when I did the PhD, it was becoming more and more clear, and you would go to seminars and learn about like how to job hunt. And basically what they said is like, you got to apply worldwide to get any job in religion, let alone like a New Testament specific field of religion. So they're like, probably there's like 1 out of 400, like one applicant for every like 400 applicants for every like one position that will open up. So I was like that's so rough. And I was getting very disillusioned with the field because like I saw this one thing with a scholar that really was like so annoying. But like, so that turned me off again big time with the way scholarship goes. It's basically, it struck me as just like a self-aggrandizing like field a lot of times. So I was like getting really disillusioned with that. I'm like, okay, I always thought I want to work in nonprofit and then do research on the side, or work research full time and do nonprofit on the side. So I was looking for nonprofit work and I found a teacher role. So I actually started as a teacher first in a Title I school, which is basically everybody qualifies for free lunch. So everybody's below the poverty line there. So went there. I was really good with behaviors with the kids. So a lot of emotional problems with the kids there, a lot of behavioral issues. I just happened to be really good dealing with those kids. So they made a position as like a behavioral specialist for me. I worked closely with the therapist in the school, and she was like, hey, you really like this work. You're doing good at it. If you go and get a master's in it, you can do like full-time work like this and just much deeper actual therapy work. So then I went back for another master's in clinical mental health counseling, and then found work in that field, like just with that demographic. So then my graduate internship and then like my counseling hour internship has been done with an organization called the Child Advocacy Center, which deals with children who are all pretty much coming from, we only take trauma cases that are like sexual or physical or significant emotional abuse. So that's like where my trauma works focuses heavily now. So yeah, long route from like getting a PhD to teacher to behavioral specialist to therapist now.
I mean, just two questions along that route. One,
yeah,
did you find that jiu-jitsu helped you deal with children who are like acting out? And
yeah,
let's start with that.
Yeah, for sure. Because number one, I noticed that like so many teachers come in there not knowing like what to expect. So the first time they get an outburst, they're like shocked, because these are teachers from like Teach for America that have a lot of these like they're thinking like movies, right? I'm gonna come in there and change things in like 2 months and change these kids. And they come in there, a kid is like throwing a chair at them, and they're like, what the hell is going on? This is not what I signed up for. So, but for me, like in that like chaotic environment, they're hitting me with brooms, they're like punching and kicking me, and I'm just like, okay, yeah. Like this, like my nervous system didn't like go crazy or anything. I was just, it's like typical. I'm used to this happening.
Yeah, well, Muay Thai, you kind of hit yourself with broomsticks to get
right.
Used to it.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I'm grinding my shins with sticks all the time. Like this is not a big thing to me. So yeah, I'd get hit with a chair, and teachers like, oh my god, are you okay? I'm like, yeah, like relax. Like I didn't feel it. So that was one thing. But then also like, I would get into like conflict sometimes with the administration, because they would teach you how to restrain sometimes, and you had to be trained for like legal reasons, ethical reasons, but it was like the stupidest way to like restrain the kids. And I'm like, you're not going to stop them doing this, and they're going to hurt themselves, and you're going to get hurt. So like I would try to like do like adjust it in ways that were like more jiu-jitsu applicable. So it'll be like back control, like you would have to turn them, but they would like make you hold their wrists like this. And I'm like, what are you guys doing? Like they're going to just turn out of it. They're little squirmy kids. So like I would do stuff where I would get like a single like wrist grip and like just hold them a bit. Like it'd be like more like hugging them in place. So jiu-jitsu was both practically helpful and emotionally helpful in those times.
That's so funny. I didn't even think about it with like needing to control kids, but yeah, that actually makes total sense.
It was so much. It was so funny. Like I would be like, oh yeah, this is back. I get the arm bar from here. There's a triangle from here.
So did your colleagues like appreciate that you had a good understanding of violence, or was it like a bit foreign to them how you applied that?
I think both. I think they really like appreciated it, especially the admin, because I was like the one of the few people there that when a kid is having like a massive breakdown like that, didn't get like scared or intimidated by it. So I would run like the ISS room, which in school suspension, but I reframed it to like in school support so that they wouldn't feel like the shame or guilt of coming there. So they really like actually enjoyed coming there, even though it was for behavioral problems. But they would come in, like I said, like kicking me, cursing me, throwing chairs, all this stuff. And anybody could come in there. So admin really appreciated that like a kid with a full on breakdown could come in there and they could just leave them there and walk away. And I wouldn't need to be like supported or comforted in these moments. Whereas other teachers, I think, would be really freaked out. I think that's where like the like discomfort with it was, because I would be there and they'd be like hitting me or in the room like trying to scratch at me or grab me, and the teacher's like, oh my god, and they're like freaking out for me, and I'm like relax, this is okay. And they were just, it was like so foreign and shocking to them. I think sometimes it was like that was the part for them that brought the discomfort. Yeah, a little bit of both there.
Was therapy kind of changed the way you approach, or being a therapist rather, changed the way you approach martial arts and violence in general?
Yeah, a lot, especially in my field, because I think it's made me a lot more aware of how much trauma affects people in just everyday life, and how much like you have to be careful of other people's space and like how you even say stuff or approach them, right? So like, and this is particularly for women who have any sort of like traumatic background, especially backgrounds in any sort of sexual assault or victimization. It's like I'm very careful with how I approach anybody, especially women, in doing a technique or showing something. It's like the way you grab somebody as you're holding them, the type of pressure that you put on. Like if I'm showing side control, making sure that I'm not like actually wrapping somebody up, even if there's not a lot of pressure. So like that sort of part of it, just the bodily awareness. And that goes for everybody, not just women, because men face all kinds of stuff, abusive parents and physical abuse, stuff like that. So anything like that, just very cautionary in how I approach physically people, but also with the words. And again, goes back to why I don't get on people verbally in classes. It's like, I don't know what they went through, so I don't want to contribute to like a triggering feeling that they have. If there's a person that's been critical of them and they do something wrong in the class, I'm not going to be like, oh, that was, okay, you're not doing it the right way there, do it this way. I'll frame it in the positive way. It's like, okay, yeah, you're getting your hip over really well, you got to turn your body this way now, right? So kind of like just the way I say stuff is reframed much differently than maybe people might be used to in a typical coaching way, where it'll be like, no, you're dropping your shoulder, you can't do that. So some people, it's not like they're soft or anything, but in their mind, just because of past trauma and experiences, the mind automatically goes to this place that's not good. So that's where I'm like very sensitive to the way people are because of the therapy and trauma work that I do.
What is it like actually being a therapist in a sport that some people use as therapy instead of going to therapy?
Yeah, well, it's awesome because there's a book that was recently written called Jiu-Jitsu in Trauma Therapy or something like that, or Jiu-Jitsu for Trauma Therapy, which two PhD therapists who do Jiu-Jitsu, it was two women, I think, or one woman PhD and one male PhD, that they wrote this whole book about how Jiu-Jitsu is really helpful for trauma work. So it's both cool to see because it is actually therapeutic, even if people don't know it. But also, like you said, it's a struggle to see. Like I want to get them to do therapy as well, because I could see that they're doing the therapy work through the jiu-jitsu in not the best way. So it's like, the achievement in jiu-jitsu, right? Or the beating somebody is like making them feel good, but it's like, no, that's not what you want. You want to like do the therapy work in a different way. You don't want to get over your like insecurities by beating somebody in jiu-jitsu, right? But like the bodily stuff, like getting stress out or something like that, or like the just tension that's released there, the feeling of confidence, like that's all the good work as I see it there as a therapist. And then I see like the negative work where it's like, no, this is not how you're supposed to use jiu-jitsu.
Have you ever pulled someone aside after class and been like, listen, you did good, but I think you should like contact an actual therapist?
No, so people will talk to me because they know I'm a therapist there. So they'll talk to me about stuff, and I always tell them, like, because ethically and legally, I can't give them therapeutic feedback, but I can give them general feedback. And I'll be like, hey, if you want, go see somebody, because that's exactly the type of work that's good in therapy. So if you need a reference or referral, like I'll give it to you. But that's something that's really good, like therapeutic work you could do in a room with somebody. But I've never like done it unsolicited. I feel like that might be crossing a line or something. I've done it teasingly to people. Like
you need therapy.
Right, yeah, yeah. I have one training partner, she's hilarious. I always like talk to her during the rounds because I know it gets to her and it lets me. She's a black belt, really good. So I always validate her. I tell her like I'm gonna validate you this whole round because I know you hate it. It's like look, you're doing really well in this. Like I can see you're confident here. So I use my therapy skills for evil in that context. But yeah, I've never unsolicited given it yet. People because I feel like people know, so they could come to me. So I feel like if they didn't know, maybe I would be more forward. But like the fact that they know who I am and that's what I do.
I
It's
love
kind
how
of
petty
doors
that
open.
is, though. That's
Yeah.
that's
So
super fun.
I love it. I like that's my funnest rounds with her because like I will just torture her the whole round. Like I don't care if I win the round; she can sub me 10 times. If I torture her, it's hilarious. So yeah, it's a very very big love hate relationship that with that
But
one
I think
person.
that's kind of beautiful that you could be in the middle of like this sort of gentle violence and still
Yeah,
kind of like nagging or like
yeah.
nudging away at people
I
emotionally and
love it.
mentally.
Yeah, it's so much fun, and that's why I love this school that I'm at as well so much because there's so many training partners like that. I had somebody that I would come in and like there was one he was a white belt. I think he's a blue belt now, but I would come in and he would like talk crap all the time. How he's gonna beat you up today and stuff, just in good
Yeah.
spirits, nothing serious. But I'm like, all right. Yeah, I'm just gonna Kimura you today. I'm getting five, and just he would try to hide his arms, and no matter what he did, I would still Kimura him. So I would just like torture him that way, just do all these kind of techniques, or just like do the most ridiculous like YouTube highlight reel technique on him just to mess with him. But it's like so much fun for everybody to do that. So it's like it's never a serious thing, and it's never mean spirited, but it's like so much fun to do all that stuff in the moments
It's such a
as you're
great
training.
environment that like you're able to create when people are not bringing everything onto the mat and they can kind of
Yeah,
make that separation.
yeah, I love it. I love it.
Is there anything that you want people to know about therapy? I mean, I feel like, as an
Yeah.
instructor and like as a therapist, you probably don't get the opportunity to be like, hey, this thing.
Yeah. No, definitely. So one is the stigmatization, right? Like therapy is so helpful. Think about it along the lines of physical health, right? Like if you've had an injury to your knee, you're not just going to leave it and like hope it gets better or do stuff on your own, right? Look up stuff on YouTube. Like you need to see a doctor. If something's broken, if something's torn, right? Like you need to deal with that. If it's a mild sprain, okay, like maybe you get away with that. But like if you have a torn knee, a broken leg, like you need to see a doctor. Same thing. If you have experiences in the past that were traumatic or even little t, we call like big T trauma, little t trauma. So even if it's like little t trauma, that's an injury to like your psyche, right? Your emotions, your brain, literally the physical structures of
What
your
are some
brain.
examples, just so that there's some context of big T and little T trauma?
Yeah, so like big T would be like sexual abuse, somebody dying in front of you, like a loved one dying. Physical abuses, emotional abuse is sometimes worse than physical abuse, and they've done studies where like emotional violence essentially triggers the same regions of the brain as physical pain. So like you are experiencing pain and emotional abuse or emotional like degradation, right? So those would be like big T traumas. Just a mom telling you like she wishes you were dead and father telling you you're a piece of shit, worthless, right? Like
Yeah.
that's the most mild, right?
Yeah.
that I've heard. So yeah, that sort of stuff would be like big T trauma. Little T would be like the death of a loved one, right? So like, and that could be big T as well, but like that's like something that's more common in the world. You have a breakup, right? You lose a job, lose money here, lose a house, something like that. Those could be more like little T traumas where they're going to affect you heavily. Like you need to work through it. It's not something like you got in a road rage or something, or somebody insulted you and you kind of just can brush it off and get over it. It's not going to sit with you.
Yeah.
The little T traumas will still sit with you. It just maybe won't affect you as much as the big ones, which can literally change the way your brain works. So yeah, that would be like the difference between those.
Got it.
But yeah, I always tell people like think of it as like physical injury. You need help to repair that, and if you don't, your knee's going to be wonky. Like it's not going to heal right, and until you get it repaired, it's going to be a detriment to like your physical health and well-being. Same thing with therapy. The other thing is therapy is not just for problems. So it's not just when you hurt your knee. If you're in physical health, you don't want to sit around all day eating junk food, not ever exercising. You still want to do 15 minutes of exercise a day, eat right, take walks, like take care of yourself. So therapy can be just for good stuff. Like if you're feeling good, go to a therapist if you have the resources and figure out like what's going really well so that you continue that. If you're in a healthy relationship, go to couples therapy and see what's working and what's not working, and then build on that because you need to know what the things are that are good so you can build on them. If it happens to be good now, but you don't actually know why, if something goes wrong, you're not going to know the good things, like how to build on those and keep those going. So those are my two big things. Like, take away the stigma. It's like, it's something that you actually need help with. It's normal. It's just like physical health. It's just the inner workings of your brain instead of your physical body. So go to it. Everybody needs it. Every therapist I know has a therapist. So it's not something that's bad.
I've been in therapy for 3-4 years, this most recent bout. And I'm like, I don't have anything that's going majorly wrong in my life. And I've always thought of therapy as giving me more tools, not necessarily as like a coaching mindset. But I think the fact that you frame it as a coaching mindset is really interesting. Like, you go to jiu-jitsu to get better at jiu-jitsu, and you have a coach tell you how to get better at jiu-jitsu.
Right.
Because they're the expert.
Yeah. And the beautiful thing about therapy is, like, that's a difference between the coaching aspect of it, right? Is that in therapy, they're not going to treat themselves like the expert of your life, right? They're the expert in the tools. So if you were to go in there and say something like, oh, I'm struggling with this, they're going to help you work within your worldview and your experience to say, yeah, tell me about that. And then when they see something, they're going to be like, oh, okay, that's interesting. That sounds like this. Does that make sense to you? Like, if you did this thing, how does that feel? Like, would that work in your situation, do you think? So it's not like an overbearing thing. It's them helping you to figure out what's best for you. So that's another intimidation factor. People sometimes think, oh, they're just going to tell me what to do and I'm not going to like it. No, therapists like work within your world. You're the expert of your world. They're the expert in helping you figure out what might work there. So yeah, that's like a really helpful thing. It's like the most validating, helpful coach you've ever had. That's never going to like be overbearing, right?
It's so funny hearing you say some of those things, because you're using the same like framing and terminology and sentence structure as when you're like, hey, maybe you should put your hip in this direction. Or you're like, it sounds the same to me.
It is very much. That's where the therapy person comes over to the jiu-jitsu person a lot of times. It's like when they're drilling, it's like, okay, this is how I do it. Like, I feel like this, but you have your own body type, your own structure, your own strengths and weaknesses. So do the thing that feels best for you. Don't just copy what I'm doing. Here's my best view of it. Do you now, right? If something that works for you, then let me know, because I want to know it too, see if it works for me. But yeah, it's very, very much crossover there a lot of times.
That's so interesting. I never really thought about it like that, but now that you're saying it like that, I realize that when I'm teaching jiu-jitsu, I do this very similar thing, use like therapy verbiage.
I was just going to say it. I wouldn't be surprised if you take that over, because people who are in therapy long-term tend to like adopt and like assimilate a lot of the language that comes over from the therapist and just the way of being. So I was going to say, I won't be surprised if you're not even recognizing maybe that you're doing like therapeutic type interactions with students just because you've been in it so long. You're learning those ways.
I for sure am. I just didn't realize it until you just said it like that.
I
think other people probably did, and I didn't.
I love that. That shows that your therapist is good though, right? Because like the one big part of therapy is like you're modeling the behavior. So if you have a conflict, the therapist, how they interact, models for you how to do stuff. Like, so that's part of therapy, is like you assimilate the stuff and you're getting healthier and developing healthier patterns without even knowing it. So that's really cool. Like, you go back to your therapist and tell them, like, hey, I realize this now, so this is helpful work. Thank you.
I'm absolutely going to do that, and she's probably going to laugh at me.
Yeah, she'll laugh, and it'll be one of those moments where you're like, gotcha.
Yeah,
as a therapist, like, you didn't even know I was doing this.
And I'm fine. If I'm getting manipulated in a way that's positive for me and the people around me, like, I'll take that as a win.
It's so funny because as a therapist, like I discuss it with my clinical supervisor. I'm like, how do I deal with the fact that I feel like I'm manipulating them somewhat, but I know I'm not. I'm doing just a therapy work. I'm like reflecting, I'm summarizing, but I feel like I'm getting them to a place where I know that they're probably going to go. Like, I don't want to manipulate them to get there. How do I keep that boundary? And she's like, no, basically what you're doing, like, you just stay very conscious of that. You do the techniques, the work, the reflections, that stuff. And then you're aware of when you try to lead versus you're not leading. So yeah, but it is fun when like you in your mind, you're like, I know where this is going, but you can't really put that out there because, again, you're not a coach, you're not a teacher, you're not an expert for them. You're a helper, a facilitator. But then when it gets to that after like a month, it's like, I was right. That's what it was. It's like a very validating feeling as a therapist. It's like, I was on the right track. That was helpful.
That's also interesting because that's how I feel sometimes when I'm like teaching and I'll show a move and then somebody will hit the move of the day on me or on somebody else, and then they'll run up to me after class and they'll be like, hey coach, I just hit the move of the day on this person. And I'm like, yes, Give them a
Yeah, it
high
feels so
five.
good. Yeah, we shout that out all the time when I have a class, like, move of the day. If somebody gets it, I shout it. Move of the day,
Oh
they got
God,
it.
I want to steal that actually. I want
Do
to.
it, yeah. It's so much fun because then everybody starts looking for it because then everybody wants that validation as well. Like everybody hunts for it. Like, I'm gonna get the move of the day here. Or if you do it to them during rolling, like I'll always do the moves that I teach to the people, and then they'll be like really stubborn, like, no, I'm not giving it to you. And I'm like, yes, you are. I'm getting this today.
I am
It's a lot of
absolutely
fun.
stealing that. I love
Yeah.
that. That's so
Just shout it out.
so
Move of the
chaotic,
day.
and I think it's super entertaining.
Yeah, the chaos is always fun.
So, is there any advice that you want to give people more generally? Maybe it could also be about therapy, but is there any advice that you just wish everyone knew?
I think, yeah, generally, I think all aspects of life focus on your internal world more than your external feedback from people. Because generally, most people don't think about other people, so you're judging yourself through your own lens. Like, do the internal positive, like, self frames for yourself and appreciate the good things about yourself. At least balance out, right? I always tell people you don't have to eliminate your negative thoughts, but just try to balance them out in all areas of life, right? So in your jiu-jitsu world, people come to me and they feel really bad about what they're doing. And then as I think of it, I'm like, man, like, yeah, okay, you're not getting arm bars right now, but you're like stopping the pass that I was doing easily a week ago, right? I was passing like 2 seconds. You're preventing me for 30 seconds from passing now. Like, that's a huge step, right? But all they're seeing in their mind is the fact that they're getting passed, right? Or that somebody's submitting them. And I'm like, no, like, balance out. Okay, yeah, you're getting passed. That's a negative. Like, you don't want to get passed. But it's taking me 30 seconds a minute now to do it. Like, reframe your positive stuff in life. And again, outside of jiu-jitsu, whatever it is, you have like negative self-talk, you feel self-conscious because you stumble upon your words. Okay, recognize that like you have a lot of good thoughts though in those stumbling of the words maybe, right? Or that other people don't really ever pick that up, or they see the good parts of you and that's never registering in them, right? So like, I think a lot of people are so, and this includes me, right? This is my own advice to myself all the time. Like, get out of your own head in terms of like thinking about how everybody else is looking at you or how the things in the world are negatively, like you're experiencing them negatively. Start reframing, again, balancing. This is not a positive psychology, pseudo like self-help. Things are bad sometimes and they're going to be bad. And like, you might not be able to change the bad, but balance your bad out with your positive framings of stuff. Doesn't eliminate the bad, but it helps you get like a better sense of yourself and like a bigger sense of security for yourself. I think that's one. And two is just be very kind to other people in all your circumstances, right? Like, it's a cliche saying of like, other people, you don't know what other people are going through, but it's so true. So like, anything that happens, I think the first best reaction is like, I wonder why they did that. Like, especially a negative thing. Like, okay, somebody cursed me out or was mean. Instead of knee-jerk reacting to it, they're an asshole. They're like, okay, I wonder why they did that. Like, why would somebody yell at me and curse at me because I cut in front of them? Like, they might be angry about something. Maybe they just lost a parent like I lost. Like, I know I was pissed off in traffic when that stuff was going on. Like, I wasn't myself. So like, maybe that's what that person is going through. So take a step back and like offer that grace and that kindness. Again, going with my religious side as well, right? Like that grace that you see in Christianity, right? Like, and in Judaism as well, like that help that you offer other people. Lead with kindness towards others. The world will be a much better place in that regard. Yeah.
I love that. I mean, that's one of the things I say quite regularly is we could use a little more love in the world, and
Yeah,
like,
100%.
very supportive of that.
Yeah.
Is there anything in the future that you're excited for?
Man, I think moves. I want to move from Gainesville because like I got here through not a lot of choices of my own. So like my mom being sick was part of it. Just COVID had happened. I was in Austin for a bit, and that kind of like screwed up the job there a bit. My mom got into a bad car accident at that time. So like weird circumstances brought me to Gainesville, and it just doesn't feel like home because it's not my choice really to be around here. So I'm excited to kind of like start building up to like a life that I'm choosing, right? So moving to a certain location. I'm thinking about overseas, different places. We talked about that like that pre-interview time. But yeah, so like that feels exciting.
Germany's
and just
great.
like,
I love it here.
Yeah. I'll pick your brain about that sometimes. But yeah, just that sort of thing, just in life in general. And just kind of like, I always kind of see things as no matter how bad they are, where's like the hope side of it? Like, what can I do to find purpose? So just continuing to find like a purpose going forward. Like, what can I do in the world that's like helpful to others? That goes back to my therapy, existential therapy. Big plug, guy named Viktor Frankl, Man's Search for Meaning. I have it in my office, actually. A Holocaust survivor whose his whole therapy and theory was like, you can't control the things around you, but you could always find purpose in your life he was in a concentration camp. His purpose was like helping other inmates there, and that got him through, right? So like finding that purpose is like such an important thing in life, and that's kind of what I look forward to, right? All right, in bad circumstances right now, maybe what can I look forward to that's going to like build me up and build a purpose in my life, helping others, helping animals, helping the world, whatever it is. So yeah, that's always an exciting part of life.
I will. You can send me like a link to the book. I'll put it in the show notes later.
Yeah, yeah.
Speaking of which, is there anything that you want to promote?
Not particularly, actually. We had our YouTube channel was the Garage Nogi. Oh, I never sent you the updated YouTube
That's
link.
okay.
For it.
I can grab it from you later.
Yeah, but I have we put out some tutorials there. Just my books. If anybody's interested in those.
Yeah, you had you have two books: the Quest for a Historical Jesus Methodology, and We Have Found the Messiah.
Yep. So we have found the Messiah, how the disciples help answer the Messianic question, or Davidic Messianic question, because I focus on Davidic royal Messiahship. That's the first one about what we were speaking of. That involves like how we know things about Jesus, the dyadic personalities, the culture, what Jesus said and did. That's that part of it. And answering that question is like, yes, I think he was a Davidic Messianic claimant, whatever he thought about himself. And then the other one, the Quest for a Historical Jesus Methodology, answers those like criteria of authenticity questions, the methodological questions, like how we do research, how other ancient historians do research into other figures of the ancient world, and like a comparison between them. So those are my two books. And then, my therapy practice is Arise Wellness, and then the Child Advocacy Center is a children's trauma one. Those are all my promos, I guess.
Yeah, I'll put them all in the show notes. Thanks
Marcelo
so much
Garcia, Gainesville.
Yeah, anybody who's in the Gainesville area, come visit, right?
Yeah.
Cool. Michael, this was a fun conversation. Thanks so much for your time.
No problem. I appreciate it.
Yep.
Thank you for listening. If you have any questions about historical Jesus and theology or discovering the value of therapy, please feel free to reach out to Michael. If you find yourself near Gainesville, Florida, USA, drop in to see Michael at Marcelo Garcia, Gainesville. You can find his contact information, the books we discussed, his therapy practice information, and the rest of the useful links in the show notes. And as always, thank you for your time and attention.